The crack of gunfire echoed through the dusty streets of Willow Creek as Katherine Adams cowered beneath the stagecoach seat, her heart pounding against her ribs like a frightened bird. This wasn't the fresh start she had imagined when she'd answered the advertisement for a mail-order bride, not with bullets whizzing overhead, and the driver slumped motionless on his perch, Colorado Territory, 1875. Katherine had traveled nearly 2,000 miles from Boston with nothing but a single trunk of belongings and a letter promising security and respectability. Now, as the stagecoach rolled to a stop in the middle of what appeared to be a robbery gone wrong, she wondered if she'd made the gravest mistake of her 22 years. "Everyone out," a gruff voice commanded. "Hands where I can see 'em." Katherine's fingers trembled as she gathered her skirts. The other passengers, an elderly couple and a traveling salesman, moved with the resigned compliance of those who understood frontier justice. She followed their lead, stepping down into the scorching afternoon sun, dust immediately coating the hem of her best traveling dress. 3 men on horseback, bandanas pulled over their faces, held pistols trained on the small group. The leader, a burly man with cold eyes visible above his mask, dismounted and began rifling through the stagecoach's cargo hold. "Please," Katherine whispered, "I have nothing of value." The man turned, his gaze traveling from her dusty boots to her pinned-up auburn hair. "Them earrings look valuable enough." Katherine's hand instinctively went to her mother's pearl earrings, the last connection to a woman 6 years in her grave. "They're just a shot cracked through the air, but not from the bandits." From somewhere behind the stage, a commanding voice called out, "I suggest you boys find business elsewhere." The robbers spun toward the newcomer, and Katherine caught her first glimpse of him, tall and broad-shouldered, with a Winchester rifle held steady in his hands. His face was shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but there was no mistaking the authority in his stance. "This ain't your concern, Nash," the leader spat. "3 armed men robbing innocent travelers on Willow Creek land makes it my concern, Decker." The man Nash stepped closer, his rifle unwavering. "You've got 30 seconds before I decide this territory needs 3 less outlaws." What followed was a tense standoff that seemed to stretch into eternity. Katherine held her breath, certain she was about to witness bloodshed. Instead, the leader made a gesture to his companions, and they slowly backed their horses away. "This ain't over," he called over his shoulder as they retreated. Only when the dust from their horses had settled did Katherine release her breath. The other passengers murmured their relief, but she found herself staring at their rescuer as he approached. He pushed his hat back, revealing a face weathered by sun and wind, with eyes the color of a summer storm. They crinkled slightly at the corners as he surveyed the shaken group. "Everyone all right?" He holstered his weapon, then looked more closely at the motionless driver. After checking the man's pulse, he announced, "He's alive, just knocked out cold." Katherine felt her knees weaken with relief. "Thank you, sir. You saved our lives." Those storm-gray eyes found hers, and for a moment something passed between them, recognition, perhaps, though they'd never met. "Name's Nathaniel Nash. Most folks just call me Nash." He tipped his hat slightly. "Welcome to Willow Creek, though I reckon this wasn't the greeting you were hoping for." "Katherine Adams," she replied, extending her gloved hand in what felt like a ridiculously formal gesture given the circumstances. I'm expected by a Mr. Thomas Crawford. I'm to be his bride." If she wasn't mistaken, something flickered across Nash's face, surprise, maybe disappointment, before his expression settled back into polite neutrality. "Crawford's place is about 5 miles north of town," he said, helping the elderly couple back into the coach. "I'll escort you all in, make sure there's no more trouble." As he checked on the driver and prepared to take the reins himself, Katherine couldn't help noticing the way his shirt stretched across broad shoulders, or how his movements carried the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to handling crises. There was something reassuring about him that made her racing heart slow to a steadier rhythm. She didn't know then that this wouldn't be the last time Nathaniel Nash would rescue her, or that the greatest danger she faced in Willow Creek had nothing to do with bandits. The stagecoach rolled into town an hour later, with Nash expertly handling the team of horses. Willow Creek was smaller than Katherine had imagined, a single dusty main street lined with wooden buildings, a far cry from Boston's cobblestone and brick. Women in practical calico dresses moved between the general store and the millinery, while men in work clothes gathered outside the saloon despite the early hour. Nash pulled the stage to a stop in front of a whitewashed building with "Doctor" painted in faded letters above the door. "Better have Doc Jenkins look at Williams here," he said, nodding to the driver who had regained consciousness but remained dazed. As the doctor and his assistant helped the driver inside, Nash turned to Katherine. "Crawford was supposed to meet the stage. Probably didn't expect it this early, what with the trouble and all. He seemed to consider something before adding, 'I can take you to his place if you'd like.'" The elderly couple and the salesman had already disembarked, offering profuse thanks to Nash before hurrying to their respective destinations. Katherine stood alone on the boardwalk, her single trunk at her feet, feeling suddenly exposed under the curious gazes of passers-by. "I would appreciate that very much, Mr. Nash," she said, attempting to sound more confident than she felt. He nodded, loading her trunk onto his wagon, which was parked nearby. "Just Nash is fine." He offered his hand to help her climb onto the wooden seat. Town's small enough that most folks are on a first-name basis within a day or two. As they pulled away from the bustle of Main Street, Katherine allowed herself to study her rescuer more carefully. His hands were calloused but gentle on the reins, his profile strong against the backdrop of endless blue sky. She guessed him to be in his early 30s, though the sun had etched lines around his eyes that made precise age difficult to determine. "May I ask how you know Mr. Crawford?" She ventured after they'd traveled in silence for several minutes. Nash's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Everyone knows everyone in these parts. Crawford runs the largest cattle operation in the county. And are you a rancher as well?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "In a manner of speaking. My place borders Crawford's to the west, smaller spread, but it suits me fine." Katherine nodded, uncertain what to say next. The letter she'd received from Thomas Crawford had been cordial but brief, a widower of 45 seeking a practical union with a woman of good character. He'd offered security, a comfortable home, and respectful treatment. For a woman with no family and dwindling resources, it had seemed the most sensible path forward. "If you don't mind my asking," Nash said, interrupting her thoughts, "what brings a lady like yourself to Willow Creek as a mail-order bride?" The directness of his question startled her, but there was no judgment in his tone, only genuine curiosity. "Circumstances," she answered, choosing her words carefully. "After my father's passing last year, I found myself with few options." She smoothed her skirts, not meeting his eyes. "Mr. Crawford's advertisement suggested a mutually beneficial arrangement." Nash's hands tightened on the reins. "Crawford's a successful man," he said flatly. "I suppose that's what matters." Something in his tone made Katherine glance at him sharply. "You don't approve of him?" "It's not my place to approve or disapprove." His gaze remained fixed on the road ahead. "Just seems to me that a woman like you might have had other choices back east." The implication stung more than it should have. "Not all of us have the luxury of choices, Mr. Nash," she replied, a defensive edge creeping into her voice. "Some of us must make the best of what opportunities present themselves." They rode in uncomfortable silence after that, the only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the distant lowing of cattle. Katherine focused on the landscape, rolling hills dotted with scrub brush, snow-capped mountains rising majestically in the distance. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way so different from Boston's manicured gardens and crowded streets. After about half an hour, Nash slowed the wagon as they approached a sprawling ranch house nestled against a backdrop of cottonwood trees. A large barn and several outbuildings stood nearby, and fenced pastures stretched as far as the eye could see. "Crawford's place," Nash announced, his voice carefully neutral. Before Katherine could respond, the front door of the house opened, and a man emerged onto the wide porch. Even from a distance, she could tell he was older than Nash, with graying hair and a substantial belly that strained against his waistcoat. He raised a hand in greeting as the wagon approached. "This is where I leave you," Nash said quietly. He helped her down from the wagon, his touch brief but steady. As he unloaded her trunk, he added in a low voice, "If you ever need anything at all, my place is just beyond that western ridge." Katherine found herself strangely reluctant to see him go. "Thank you again, Mr. Nash." "I'm indebted to you." Something flashed in those storm-gray eyes. "No debt between neighbors. Good luck, Miss Adams." With that, he climbed back onto his wagon and with a final tip of his hat, turned the team around and headed back the way they'd come. Katherine watched him go, an unexpected sense of loss settling over her. "Miss Adams," Thomas Crawford's voice boomed as he descended the porch steps. "Welcome to my home. I see you've met Nash already." Katherine turned to face her future husband, forcing a smile to her lips. "Yes, there was some trouble with the stagecoach. Mr. Nash was kind enough to bring me here." Crawford's expression darkened slightly. "Trouble? What sort of trouble?" "Bandits," she explained, describing the attempted robbery. "If Mr. Nash hadn't intervened, I fear things might have ended quite differently." Crawford made a non-committal sound. "Well, you're safe now, that's what matters." He gestured toward the house. "Shall we go inside? You must be exhausted from your journey." As she followed him up the steps, Katherine couldn't help glancing back toward the western ridge where Nash had said his ranch lay. For reasons she couldn't quite articulate, knowing he was nearby brought her a strange comfort. Crawford's housekeeper, Mrs. Belmont, showed Katherine to a spacious bedroom on the second floor. The room was well appointed with heavy oak furniture and floral curtains that seemed at odds with the rugged landscape outside. After helping her unpack her meager belongings, the older woman left her to rest before supper. Alone for the first time since arriving in Willow Creek, Katherine sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed her composure to slip. The day's events, the terrifying robbery, the rescue by the enigmatic Nash, and now the reality of her new life with a man she'd never met before today overwhelmed her. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks as she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake, but what choice did she have? After her father's debts had been settled, there had been nothing left. No home, no dowry, no prospects. When her father's former business associate had suggested the matrimonial advertisement as a solution, it had seemed like divine providence. Now, as she washed the dust of travel from her face and changed into her second-best dress for dinner, Katherine resolved to make the best of her situation. Thomas Crawford might not inspire the romantic notions she'd secretly harbored as a girl, but he seemed respectable enough. He'd offered her security and a home. That would have to be sufficient. Dinner that evening was a stilted affair. Crawford spoke at length about his cattle business and his position as one of the founding members of Willow Creek. He asked few questions about Katherine's life in Boston, seeming more interested in establishing his own importance than in getting to know his future bride. "I've arranged for us to be married on Saturday," he announced as Mrs. Belmont served apple pie. "Pastor Williams has agreed to perform the ceremony at the church in town." Katherine nearly choked on her bite of pie. "This Saturday, but that's only 3 days away." Crawford raised his eyebrows. "Is that a problem? I assumed you'd want to establish your position here as quickly as possible." "No, I suppose not," she said, setting down her fork. "It's just rather sudden." "No sense delaying," he replied with a dismissive wave. "Besides, there's a social at the Wilsons' on Saturday evening. It would be a good opportunity to introduce you to everyone as Mrs. Crawford." Mrs. Crawford. The name felt foreign, a garment that didn't quite fit. But Katherine nodded her agreement, reminding herself that this was precisely what she'd agreed to in their correspondence. Later, as she prepared for bed, she found herself standing at the window, gazing out at the vast, star-studded sky. Somewhere beyond that western ridge, Nathaniel Nash was perhaps doing the same. The thought brought an unexpected warmth to her cheeks, which she quickly dismissed as foolishness. She was here to marry Thomas Crawford. Any notions about his neighbor were inappropriate and unwelcome. Yet when sleep finally claimed her, it was storm-gray eyes that followed her into her dreams. The next morning, Katherine rose early, determined to learn more about her new home. Crawford had already left to attend to business in town, leaving her in Mrs. Belmont's capable but somewhat austere care. "Mr. Crawford said to show you around the house and grounds," the housekeeper said over breakfast. "He wants you familiar with everything before the wedding." Katherine spent the morning touring the sprawling ranch house, which was larger and more luxurious than she'd anticipated. Crawford clearly took pride in his possessions, many of which had been shipped at great expense from back east. The library particularly impressed her with its leather-bound volumes and comfortable reading chairs positioned near large windows. After lunch, Mrs. Belmont suggested a walk around the immediate grounds. "The garden's not what it should be," she confided as they strolled among neglected flower beds. "Not since the first Mrs. Crawford passed. She had a way with plants." Katherine paused, realizing she knew almost nothing about her predecessor. How long ago did she die? "Going on 5 years now," Mrs. Belmont replied. "Consumption took her." A gentle soul Mrs. Elizabeth was. Before Katherine could ask more, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. 3 riders were coming up the long drive, and even from a distance, she recognized the broad-shouldered silhouette of Nathaniel Nash. "What's he doing here?" Mrs. Belmont muttered, more to herself than to Katherine. As the riders drew closer, Katherine could see that Nash was accompanied by 2 other men, one Native American and one who appeared to be Mexican. They stopped their horses a respectful distance from where the women stood. "Afternoon, Mrs. Belmont," Nash called, removing his hat. His eyes found Katherine's and he nodded. "Miss Adams." "Mr. Nash," Katherine replied, inexplicably pleased to see him again. "What brings you here today?" "Cattle business," he answered. "Is Crawford around?" Mrs. Belmont stepped forward. "He's in town, expected back before supper." Nash exchanged glances with his companions. "Mind if we water our horses before heading back? Been riding fence lines since dawn." "Help yourselves," Mrs. Belmont said stiffly. "You know where the trough is." As the men led their mounts toward the water trough near the barn, Katherine found herself following, ignoring Mrs. Belmont's disapproving look. "I didn't properly thank you yesterday," she said as she approached Nash, "for the rescue and for bringing me here." He looked up from adjusting his horse's bridle, surprise evident in his expression. "No thanks necessary. Nevertheless, I'm grateful." She glanced at his companions, who were giving them curious looks. "Won't you introduce me to your friends?" Nash nodded. "Miss Adams, this is Manuel Reyes, my foreman." The Mexican man tipped his hat with a warm smile. "And this is John Running Deer, best tracker in the territory." The Native American man inclined his head respectfully. "Miss, a pleasure to meet you both," Katherine said sincerely. "Miss Adams is to be married to Crawford on Saturday," Nash explained to his men, though there was an undercurrent in his voice Katherine couldn't quite identify. "Congratulations," Manuel offered, though his eyes darted uncertainly between her and Nash. "Thank you," she replied, suddenly aware of how awkward the situation felt. "I should return to the house. Mrs. Belmont is showing me around the property." Nash nodded, his expression unreadable. "We won't keep you then." As she turned to go, he added, "Miss Adams." When she looked back, he said, "There's to be a social at the Wilsons' place on Saturday evening. Perhaps we'll see you there." "Yes," she confirmed. "Mr. Crawford mentioned it." Something like a shadow crossed Nash's face. "Good day, then." Katherine rejoined Mrs. Belmont, who was waiting with visible impatience. As they walked back toward the house, the older woman remarked, "Mr. Crawford wouldn't approve of you speaking to Nash alone like that." Katherine frowned. "We were hardly alone. His men were right there, as were you." Mrs. Belmont pursed her lips. "There's bad blood between Mr. Crawford and Nash, has been for years." "What sort of bad blood?" Katherine asked, her curiosity piqued. "Not my place to say," the housekeeper replied primly. "Just best you keep your distance is all." Katherine glanced back toward the barn where Nash and his men were mounting their horses. "Mr. Nash seems honorable enough. He saved us from bandits yesterday." "Oh, he's honorable," Mrs. Belmont agreed unexpectedly. "Too honorable for his own good, some might say." But that doesn't make him and Mr. Crawford friends. Before Katherine could press for more information, they were interrupted by the arrival of Crawford himself, returning earlier than expected from town. He frowned deeply upon seeing Nash and his men riding away from his property. "What was he doing here?" he demanded as he dismounted. "Looking for you, sir," Mrs. Belmont answered. "Something about cattle business." Crawford's scowl deepened. "That man knows better than to come onto my land." He turned to Katherine, his expression softening slightly. "I hope he didn't bother you, my dear." "Not at all," she assured him. "He was perfectly courteous," Crawford snorted. "Nash has always known how to put on a good face for the ladies." He offered his arm to Katherine. "Come inside, I've brought a surprise for you from town." The surprise turned out to be a length of cream-colored silk for a wedding dress. It was a generous gift, and Katherine expressed her gratitude appropriately, though she couldn't help wondering about the tension between Crawford and Nash. What could have caused such animosity between neighbors? That evening, as they sat in the parlor after dinner, Katherine gathered her courage to ask. "Mrs. Belmont mentioned that you and Mr. Nash have some history." Crawford's face darkened. "Mrs. Belmont talks too much." He took a long sip of his brandy before continuing. "Nash and I have different views on how things should be done in this territory. He's soft on the Indians, for one thing, letting that running deer fellow work for him, even live on his property." "Is that so unusual?" Katherine asked. "It is when the rest of us have lost good men and cattle to Indian raids," Crawford replied sharply. "But that's just the start of it. Nash is always interfering in matters that don't concern him. Thinks he knows better than those of us who have built something in this valley." There was more to it than that, Katherine suspected, but Crawford clearly didn't wish to elaborate. The conversation turned to wedding plans, and she didn't press the issue further. Later, alone in her room, Katherine stood at the window once more, gazing toward the western ridge. Nash's ranch lay somewhere beyond, and she found herself wondering what kind of home he had built there. Was it as grand as Crawford's, or something more modest? Did he live alone, or was there a Mrs. Nash? The thought brought an unexpected pang of what? Not jealousy, surely. She barely knew the man. Yet there was something about Nathaniel Nash that intrigued her in a way Thomas Crawford, for all his wealth and position, did not. Shaking her head at her own foolishness, Katherine turned away from the window. In 3 days, she would be Mrs. Thomas Crawford. Any idle thoughts about his neighbor were inappropriate and unworthy of her. Yet as she drifted off to sleep, it was Nash's storm-gray eyes and quiet strength that followed her into her dreams once more. The next 2 days passed in a flurry of wedding preparations. Crawford spared no expense, ordering flowers from Denver and hiring the town's best seamstress to fashion Katherine's wedding gown from the silk he'd provided. Katherine went through the motions dutifully, allowing herself to be measured and fitted, approving menu selections, and learning the names of the local dignitaries who would attend the ceremony. Through it all, she tried to feel anything for the man she was about to marry. Thomas Crawford wasn't unkind exactly, but neither was he particularly warm. He treated her more like a prize acquisition than a future wife, showing her off to business associates who visited the ranch and making plans for her role as hostess of future gatherings without consulting her preferences. "You'll need to update your wardrobe," he remarked on the eve of their wedding as they sat in the parlor after dinner. "What you've brought is fine for Boston, but a rancher's wife needs more practical attire. I've arranged credit for you at the mercantile in town." "That's very generous," Katherine replied automatically, though his constant reminders of her dependence on his largesse were beginning to grate. "I want my wife to reflect well on me," he said, as if that explained everything. "Speaking of which, there's something we should discuss before tomorrow." Katherine set aside her embroidery, giving him her full attention. "Yes," Crawford cleared his throat, suddenly looking uncomfortable. "I should make my expectations clear regarding children." Heat rushed to Katherine's cheeks. This was hardly a proper conversation between two people who weren't yet married, but she supposed frontier customs differed from those in Boston. "I'm not opposed to children," Crawford continued, oblivious to her discomfort, "but at my age I don't particularly desire to start a new family." My son from my first marriage will inherit the ranch. I trust this arrangement is acceptable to you." Catherine blinked in surprise. "You have a son." "You never mentioned him in your letters." Crawford waved a dismissive hand. "James is away at school back east, has been for years. He'll be returning next month for the summer." "I see," Catherine said slowly, absorbing this new information. "How old is he?" 19, nearly a man now. Crawford refilled his brandy glass. "So, as I was saying, regarding children of our own." "I understand your position," Catherine interrupted, not wanting to hear him elaborate further. The thought of sharing Crawford's bed was unsettling enough without this clinical discussion of potential offspring. He nodded, looking relieved. "Good. I believe will suit very well, Catherine. You have a practical nature that I admire." Practical. The word echoed in her mind as she excused herself to retire early. Was that all she was? A practical solution to Crawford's need for a presentable wife? Had she really traveled 2,000 miles for such a cold arrangement? But what alternative did she have? Return to Boston in disgrace with no home and no prospects? No, she had made her decision. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Thomas Crawford, and she would make the best of the security and position the marriage offered. Still, as she lay awake that night, the eve of her wedding, Catherine couldn't help wondering if there might have been another path, one where marriage brought not just security but also warmth, perhaps even love. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, the sky an endless expanse of Colorado blue. Mrs. Belmont and the seamstress helped Catherine dress in her cream silk gown, which was undeniably beautiful with its lace trim and modestly cut bodice. "You make a lovely bride," Mrs. Belmont said, a rare softness in her voice as she pinned the short veil to Catherine's upswept hair. "Thank you," Catherine replied, studying her reflection in the mirror. She looked pale but composed, her green eyes large in her heart-shaped face. Was this how her mother had looked on her wedding day? Had she felt this same mixture of resignation and trepidation? Crawford had arranged for a carriage to take them into town for the ceremony. As they traveled the now familiar road, Catherine tried to calm her racing heart by focusing on the beauty of the landscape. The mountains stood majestic in the distance, wildflowers dotted the prairie, and the air carried the sweet scent of summer. The church in Willow Creek was a simple white clapboard building with a modest steeple. Despite its small size, it seemed that most of the town had turned out for the wedding of one of its most prominent citizens. Catherine saw curious faces watching from the church steps as Crawford helped her from the carriage. "Ready, my dear?" he asked, offering his arm. She nodded, unable to trust her voice. This was it. In just moments, she would be married to this man she barely knew. The ceremony itself passed in a blur. Pastor Williams, a kind-faced man with a sonorous voice, led them through the traditional vows. Catherine repeated the words mechanically, promising to love, honor, and obey Thomas Crawford until death parted them. When he placed the gold band on her finger, it felt heavy, binding in a way she hadn't anticipated, and then it was done. Pastor Williams pronounced them man and wife, and Crawford placed a perfunctory kiss on her lips, their first physical contact beyond a formal handshake or assistance into a carriage. "Mrs. Crawford," he said with satisfaction as they turned to face the assembled guests. The reception was held in the church hall, where tables had been set with white cloths and vases of wildflowers. A small band played in the corner as guests offered their congratulations and well wishes. Catherine smiled and thanked them, trying to commit names and faces to memory. It was during this receiving line that she first saw Nash. He stood near the back of the hall, watching the proceedings with an unreadable expression. Unlike most of the other men who wore their Sunday best, Nash was dressed simply in clean work clothes, as if he'd come straight from his ranch. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and something passed between them, a current of recognition, perhaps regret. Before Catherine could decipher it, Crawford's hand tightened on her waist, drawing her attention to the next well-wisher. The afternoon wore on, a whirl of cake and punch and polite conversation. Catherine found herself seated beside Crawford at the head table, watching as he conversed with the mayor and other important citizens, occasionally introducing her with obvious pride in his Eastern bride. It was during a lull in these introductions that Nash approached their table. Crawford's expression immediately hardened. "Nash," he acknowledged coolly, "didn't expect to see you here." "Wouldn't miss the social," Nash replied evenly. His gaze shifted to Katherine. "Congratulations, Mrs. Crawford. I wish you every happiness." "Thank you, Mr. Nash," she managed, aware of Crawford's hand once again tightening possessively on her waist. Nash nodded once more before moving away, stopping to speak with Manuel and John Running Deer, who sat at a table near the door. "I should have known he'd show up," Crawford muttered. "Always pushing boundaries, that one." Katherine didn't respond, her attention drawn to the way Nash interacted with his men, the easy camaraderie, the genuine smiles. It stood in stark contrast to the formality with which Crawford treated his ranch hands, who had been invited to the reception but sat stiffly at their assigned table, clearly uncomfortable in the social setting. As evening approached, guests began to depart for the Wilsons' social, which would feature dancing and more substantial refreshments. Katherine and Crawford returned to the ranch briefly to change clothes before joining the festivities. "You've done well today," Crawford told her as they rode in the carriage. "Everyone was impressed." "I'm glad," she replied automatically, though his approval brought her little satisfaction. The reality of their marriage, of sharing his home and his life, was beginning to settle over her like a weight. The Wilson Ranch was larger than Crawford's, with a sprawling main house and several outbuildings. Lanterns had been strung between trees, creating a festive atmosphere in the gathering dusk. The barn had been cleared for dancing, with hay bales arranged around the perimeter for seating. As the new Mrs. Crawford, Katherine found herself the center of attention once more. Women she'd been introduced to earlier sought her out, asking about Boston and her journey west. She answered politely, gradually becoming more comfortable in her role as Crawford's wife. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Crawford?" her husband asked as the band struck up a lively tune. Katherine nodded, allowing him to lead her onto the makeshift dance floor. Crawford was a competent if uninspired dancer, moving through the steps of the Virginia reel with practiced precision. As they separated and rejoined according to the dance's pattern, Katherine caught glimpses of Nash standing near the barn entrance, watching the proceedings with those observant gray eyes. When the music ended, Crawford escorted her to a bench near the refreshment table. "I need to speak with Wilson about a business matter," he told her. "Will you be all right here for a few minutes?" "Of course," she assured him, grateful for a moment alone. No sooner had Crawford walked away than Nash approached, 2 cups of punch in his hands. "Thought you might be thirsty," he said, offering her one. Katherine hesitated only briefly before accepting. "Thank you." He sat beside her, leaving a respectable distance between them. "How are you finding married life so far?" The question could have sounded mocking, but his tone was genuine. "It's been less than a day," she reminded him with a small smile. "Hardly enough time to form an opinion." Nash nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. "Crawford's a fortunate man." The simple statement, delivered without flattery or artifice, brought unexpected warmth to her cheeks. "You're very kind." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching the dancers. Then Nash said quietly, "I hope he treats you well." Something in his tone made Katherine turn to study him. "You don't think he will?" Nash's expression revealed nothing. "It's not my place to say." "Yet you clearly have thoughts on the matter," she pressed. He met her gaze directly. "I know that you came here seeking safety. I just hope you find what you're looking for." Before she could respond, Crawford reappeared, his face darkening at the sight of Nash sitting beside his wife. "Katherine, I believe Mrs. Wilson was asking for you," he said pointedly. Nash stood immediately. "Just keeping your wife company while you were occupied, Crawford." To Katherine, he added, "Thank you for the conversation, Mrs. Crawford." As he walked away, Crawford took his vacated seat. "I thought I made it clear that Nash isn't someone we associate with." "He was merely being polite," Katherine defended, surprised by the force of Crawford's animosity. "That man has never done anything without purpose," Crawford retorted. "Stay away from him, Katherine, I mean it." The vehemence in his voice startled her. This wasn't merely the annoyance of a man whose wife had been speaking to someone he disliked. This was deeper, more personal. "Thomas," she said, using his given name for perhaps the first time, "what exactly happened between you and Mr. Nash?" Crawford's jaw tightened. "That's none of your concern." "I believe it is if I'm to avoid him as you wish," she countered, summoning her courage. "How can I understand your feelings if I don't know their cause?" For a moment, she thought he might refuse to answer. Then he said curtly, "Nash believes I cheated him out of land that rightfully belonged to him. He's been trying to undermine me ever since." "And did you?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Crawford's face flushed with anger. "The land was legally purchased. If his grandfather failed to secure proper documentation, that's hardly my fault." He stood abruptly. "This conversation is over. Come, they're starting another dance." As he led her back to the dance floor, Katherine couldn't help glancing around for Nash, but he seemed to have disappeared. The rest of the evening passed without incident, though Crawford remained in a sour mood, his earlier pride in his new wife apparently forgotten. It was late when they finally returned to the ranch. Katherine's stomach twisted with anxiety as they entered the house. Tonight would be her wedding night, the consummation of their marriage. Though she understood what was expected, the thought of Crawford's hands on her filled her with dread rather than anticipation. In their bedroom, his bedroom, now shared, he wasted little time on preliminaries. His kisses were perfunctory, his hands efficient rather than tender as they unbuttoned her dress. Katherine endured his attentions, reminding herself that this was her duty as a wife. When it was over, Crawford rolled away without a word, soon falling into a deep sleep that left Katherine staring at the ceiling, feeling hollow and alone. If this was marriage, she thought, it was a poor substitute for the dreams she'd once harbored of companionship and genuine affection. She turned on her side, facing away from her husband, and allowed a single tear to slip down her cheek. It was done. She was truly Mrs. Thomas Crawford now, bound to this man and this life for better or worse. As she finally drifted towards sleep, Katherine tried to convince herself that things would improve with time, that she would grow to care for Crawford and he for her, that this emptiness would eventually be filled, but somewhere in her heart she knew it was a lie. The following weeks brought Katherine a gradual adjustment to her new role as Mrs. Crawford. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, took over management of the household from Mrs. Belmont, and began to know the people of Willow Creek during weekly trips to town. Crawford was not unkind, exactly. He provided generously for her material needs and seemed pleased to show off his attractive young wife to business associates. But there was a coldness to him that never thawed, even in their most intimate moments. He treated her more as a possession than a partner, expecting her complete obedience while sharing little of his thoughts or feelings. Katherine tried to be a good wife. She kept the house immaculate, learned to cook Western dishes under Mrs. Belmont's grudging tutelage, and never complained about the loneliness that had become her constant companion. On the surface, she was the perfect Mrs. Crawford, poised, efficient, and unfailingly polite, but inside a hollow ache grew with each passing day. She saw Nash occasionally in town or at church on Sundays. They exchanged polite greetings, nothing more, though she sometimes caught him watching her with those perceptive gray eyes. Each brief encounter left her with a peculiar mixture of comfort and longing that she refused to examine too closely. It was during the hottest part of July, nearly a month after her wedding, that everything began to change. Crawford's son, James, arrived from his Eastern school, bringing with him an arrogance that surpassed even his father's. "So you're the mail-order bride," he said upon meeting Katherine, his eyes traveling over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Father didn't mention how young you are." "James," Crawford said sharply, "show some respect." The young man smirked but offered a mocking bow. "My apologies, Mother." The title, delivered with such derision, made Katherine flinch. "Please call me Katherine." James was his father's son, in appearance tall and solidly built, with the same heavy features and calculating eyes. But where Crawford at least maintained a veneer of civility, James seemed to delight in testing boundaries and creating discomfort. His presence in the house disrupted the careful routine Catherine had established. He tracked mud across freshly cleaned floors, left his belongings scattered throughout common areas, and made demands of Mrs. Belmont that the housekeeper clearly resented but dared not refuse. Crawford, to Catherine's dismay, seemed blind to his son's behavior. "He's just high-spirited," he said dismissively when she tentatively raised concerns. "You'll get used to him." But as the days passed, James's behavior toward Catherine grew increasingly inappropriate. He found reasons to brush against her in hallways, made suggestive comments when his father wasn't present, and once accidentally walked in on her while she was dressing. Catherine tried to avoid being alone with him, but in the confines of the ranch house, this proved difficult. Crawford was often away on business, leaving her to fend off his son's unwanted attentions. The situation came to a head one afternoon in early August. Catherine was in the library, dusting shelves, when James entered and closed the door behind him. "All alone again," he observed, leaning against the door. "Father really shouldn't leave such a pretty young wife unattended." Catherine kept her voice steady. "Your father trusts me to manage the household in his absence." James moved closer, his eyes never leaving her face. "What my father doesn't know won't hurt him. Please step aside," Catherine said firmly, gathering her dusting cloths. "I have work to do." Instead, James reached out and caught her wrist. "You can't fool me with your proper Boston manners. What kind of woman travels across the country to marry a man she's never met, if not one looking for adventure?" Catherine tried to pull away, but his grip tightened painfully. "Let go of me, now, or what?" he taunted, backing her against the bookshelf. "You'll tell father." "Who do you think he'll believe, his son or the woman he bought to warm his bed?" Panic rose in Catherine's throat as James pressed closer, his free hand moving to her waist. "You're hurting me," she gasped. "I could show you what it's like to be with a real man," he murmured, his face inches from hers. Not some old, the library door burst open, and Mrs. Belmont stood in the doorway, her eyes widening at the scene before her. "Mr. James, your father is looking for you." James released Catherine immediately, stepping back with a casual shrug. "We were just getting acquainted," he said with a smirk before sauntering past the housekeeper and out of the room. Catherine sagged against the bookshelf, her heart pounding in her chest. "Are you all right, Mrs. Crawford?" Mrs. Belmont asked, genuine concern in her voice for perhaps the first time. "Yes," Catherine managed, though her wrist throbbed where James had gripped it. "Thank you for interrupting." The older woman's face was grim. "It's not my place to speak ill of Mr. Crawford's son, but—" She hesitated. "Be careful around that one. He's not right in the head, if you ask me." Catherine nodded, still shaken. "Does Mr. Crawford know how his son behaves?" Mrs. Belmont's expression said everything. "Mr. Crawford sees what he wants to see when it comes to that boy." That evening, Catherine attempted to broach the subject with her husband as they sat in the parlor after dinner. James had gone into town, giving her a rare opportunity to speak privately. "Thomas," she began carefully, "I'm concerned about James's behavior." Crawford looked up from his newspaper with a frown. "What about it?" Catherine chose her words with care. "He can be inappropriate at times, especially when you're not present." "Inappropriate how?" Crawford's tone held a note of warning. "He makes comments that are unsuitable. And today in the library he grabbed my wrist and wouldn't let go." She showed him the bruise that had formed, purple against her pale skin. Crawford's expression darkened, but not with the protective anger she'd hoped for. "What were you doing alone with him in the library?" Catherine stared at him in disbelief. "I was dusting the shelves. He came in and closed the door. And you expect me to believe he simply attacked you without provocation?" Crawford's voice had taken on a dangerous edge. "Perhaps you encouraged him in some way." "Encouraged him?" Catherine repeated, stunned. "How can you think that?" Crawford set aside his newspaper with deliberate calm. "James told me you've been flirting with him since he arrived. I chose to dismiss it as a young man's fancy, but now I wonder." Hot tears of anger and humiliation stung Catherine's eyes. "That's a lie. He's been making advances toward me since the day he arrived. Mrs. Belmont can confirm it." She interrupted him. "Today. Mrs. Belmont works for me, not you," Crawford said coldly. "She'll say whatever you tell her to." Why would I lie about this? Katherine demanded, her voice rising despite her best efforts to remain composed. Crawford's face was like stone. Perhaps you find marriage to an older man less exciting than you anticipated. Perhaps you thought my son might provide the entertainment you crave. The unfairness of the accusation took Katherine's breath away. How dare you, she whispered. I have been nothing but faithful and dutiful as your wife. See that you remain so, Crawford replied, returning to his newspaper as if the matter were settled. And stay away from James. I won't have discord in my house. Katherine sat frozen in her chair, unable to believe what had just transpired. Her husband had chosen to believe his son's lies over her truth. He had essentially accused her of attempting to seduce James when the reality was exactly the opposite. In that moment, something broke inside her, the last fragile hope that her marriage might eventually grow into something resembling happiness. Crawford would never trust her, never truly see her. She was simply another possession to him, like his house or his cattle. That night, as she lay beside her sleeping husband, Katherine made a decision. She could not remain in this house with James's predatory presence and Crawford's blind refusal to see the truth. She needed help, and there was only one person in Willow Creek she trusted enough to ask. The opportunity came 3 days later, when Crawford announced he would be traveling to Denver on business and would be gone for at least a week. James, to Katherine's immense relief, would be accompanying him. I expect you to manage things here in my absence, Crawford told her as he prepared to depart. Mrs. Belmont will assist you with anything you need. Katherine nodded dutifully, hiding the turmoil beneath her calm exterior. Safe travels, she said, accepting his perfunctory kiss on her cheek. As the buggy carrying Crawford and James disappeared down the long drive, Katherine turned to Mrs. Belmont. I need to go into town today, she announced. Would you mind if I took the small wagon? The housekeeper looked surprised. Katherine rarely went to town alone, but nodded. Of course, Mrs. Crawford, shall I send one of the hands to drive you? That won't be necessary, Katherine replied with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. I can manage. An hour later, she was driving the wagon toward Willow Creek, her heart pounding with anxiety and determination. She had no plan beyond finding Nash and asking for his advice. What she would do after that, she couldn't say. The town was busy with its usual weekday activity, women shopping at the mercantile, men conducting business at the bank or saloon, children playing in the dusty street. Katherine tied the wagon outside the general store and stepped inside, hoping to learn where she might find Nash without drawing undue attention. Mr. Peterson, the storekeeper, greeted her warmly. Mrs. Crawford, what a pleasant surprise. What can I help you with today? Katherine managed a smile. I need a few things for the house. She selected some items at random: coffee, sugar, a spool of thread before casually asking, I was also hoping to speak with Mr. Nash about some calves Mr. Crawford was interested in. Would you happen to know where I might find him? If Peterson found the request odd, he didn't show it. Nash usually takes lunch at Clara's cafe around this time, he offered, just down the street. Katherine thanked him, paid for her purchases, and headed toward the small cafe at the end of the main street. Through the window, she could see Nash sitting alone at a corner table, a cup of coffee and half-eaten sandwich before him. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door. The bell above it jingled, causing several heads to turn in her direction, including Nash's. Surprise flickered across his face, followed by concern as he noted her presence alone in town. Katherine walked directly to his table, aware of the curious gazes following her. Mr. Nash, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Might I have a word with you? Nash stood immediately, pulling out a chair for her. Of course, Mrs. Crawford. As she sat, Clara herself approached the table. Can I get you anything, Mrs. Crawford? Just tea, please, Katherine replied, waiting until the woman had moved away before turning to Nash. Thank you for seeing me. Nash studied her face, those perceptive eyes missing nothing. What's wrong? He asked quietly. The simple question, asked with genuine concern, nearly undid her composure. I need your help, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Nash leaned forward, his expression grave. Tell me. And so she did, in halting sentences that grew stronger as she continued. She told him about James's inappropriate behavior, Crawford's refusal to believe her, the increasing sense of danger she felt in her own home. Throughout her account, Nash listened without interruption, his face growing increasingly troubled. "I don't know what to do," she concluded, fighting back tears. "Crawford and James are in Denver for the week, but when they return—" She trailed off, the implications clear. Nash was silent for a long moment, his brow furrowed in thought. Finally, he said, "You could leave, go back east." Katherine shook her head. "With what money? Everything I had went into coming here. And even if I could afford the journey, what would I return to? I have no family, no home there." "Then stay with me," Nash said, the words seemingly surprising him as much as her. He quickly clarified, "I have a cabin on my property where my foreman's sister lived before she married. It's small but comfortable. You'd be safe there while we figure out what to do next." Katherine stared at him, scarcely able to believe what he was suggesting. "You would do that for me, knowing it would anger Crawford?" A hint of a smile touched Nash's lips. "Crawford and I passed the point of mere anger long ago," his expression sobered. "But yes, I would. No woman deserves to live in fear, especially not in her own home." Clara returned with Katherine's tea, forcing a pause in their conversation. When she'd gone again, Katherine asked the question that had been nagging at her since her wedding day. "What really happened between you and Crawford?" "He said something about land that belonged to your grandfather." Nash's jaw tightened. "That's part of it." He hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "My grandfather was one of the first settlers in this valley. He built a relationship with the Ute tribe that lived here, traded fairly with them. When he died, he left the ranch to my father with clear boundaries that had been respected for years." He took a sip of his coffee before continuing. "Then Crawford arrived. He saw the valley's potential for cattle grazing and started buying up land. When my father refused to sell, Crawford found a way to claim that our western pastures weren't properly deeded. There was a legal battle, but Crawford had money and connections my father didn't. We lost nearly half our grazing land." "That's terrible," Katherine said softly. Nash shrugged, though the old pain was evident in his eyes. "It broke my father. He started drinking, neglected what was left of the ranch. By the time he died 3 years later, we were nearly bankrupt. But you rebuilt," Katherine observed. "Your ranch seems prosperous now." A genuine smile crossed Nash's face. "It took time and a lot of help from Manuel and John. We run fewer cattle but better stock, breeding rather than just grazing." Katherine considered this history, understanding now the depth of the animosity between the two men. "And Crawford has never acknowledged what he did. Crawford believes might makes right," Nash replied simply. "In his mind, he was just being a smart businessman. The fact that it destroyed my family means nothing to him." The bell above the door jingled again, and Katherine glanced up to see Mrs. Wilson, the banker's wife, entering the cafe. She would certainly report Katherine's tert with Nash back to Crawford upon his return. "People are watching," she murmured to Nash. "I should go," he nodded, understanding the delicacy of her position. "Meet me at sunset at the old lightning-struck oak near the creek that marks our property line," he said quietly. "Bring only what you can carry in a small bag. I'll take care of the rest." Katherine felt a rush of gratitude mixed with trepidation. "Thank you," she whispered, rising from her chair. In a louder voice, she added, "I appreciate your insights on cattle breeding, Mr. Nash. I'm sure my husband will find them valuable." Nash played along seamlessly. "Anytime, Mrs. Crawford. Give my regards to Thomas." As Katherine left the cafe, she felt Mrs. Wilson's curious gaze following her. By evening, half the town would know she'd spoken with Nash, but with any luck, it would be days before the news reached Crawford in Denver. By then, she would be gone. The sun was setting in a blaze of orange and purple as Katherine approached the lightning-struck oak. She had left a note for Mrs. Belmont explaining that she had been called to Denver by her husband and would return with him in a week. It wouldn't stand up to scrutiny for long, but it might buy her some time. Nash was already waiting, mounted on his gelding with a second horse, a gentle-looking mare beside him. He dismounted as she approached, his expression a mixture of relief and concern. "You came," he said simply. "Did you think I wouldn't?" Katherine asked, clutching her small carpet bag containing a change of clothes, her mother's locket, and the few personal items she couldn't bear to leave behind. Nash took the bag from her, securing it to the mare's saddle. "I thought you might reconsider. It's no small thing leaving your husband." "He's not much of a husband," Katherine replied, the bitterness in her voice surprising even her. "And I fear his son more than I fear the consequences of leaving." Nash nodded, helping her mount the mare. "It's about an hour's ride to my place," he said, swinging back onto his own horse. "The cabin is on the far side of the ranch, away from the main house. You'll have privacy there." They rode in companionable silence as darkness fell, following a trail that wound through stands of pine and across open meadows. The air grew cooler as they climbed, carrying the scent of sage and wildflowers. For the first time since arriving in Colorado, Katherine felt something like peace. Nash's ranch, when they finally reached it, was smaller than Crawford's, but no less impressive in its own way. The main house was built of sturdy logs with a wide porch wrapping around three sides. Nearby stood a large barn, several corrals, and a bunkhouse where, Nash explained, Manuel and the other hands lived. "John has his own cabin near the creek," he added as they rode past the main buildings. "And yours is just beyond that rise." The cabin, when they reached it, was indeed small, just one room with a lean-to addition at the back. But it was clean and well-maintained, with cheerful curtains at the windows and a small porch facing the mountains. "It's not much," Nash said as he helped her dismount, "but you'll be safe here." Katherine felt tears of gratitude stinging her eyes. "It's perfect," she whispered. "I don't know how to thank you." Nash lit a lantern, illuminating the cabin's interior: a bed with a colorful quilt, a small table with two chairs, a cooking area with a cast iron stove, and shelves lined with basic provisions. "Manuel's sister left some of her things," he explained, setting Katherine's bag on the table. "There's fresh water in the bucket, and the outhouse is just behind the cabin. If you need anything else, the main house is within shouting distance." Katherine turned to face him, suddenly overwhelmed by the enormity of what he had done for her. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "You barely know me." Nash's expression softened in the lamplight. "I know enough," he said quietly. "I know you're brave and kind. I know you deserved better than what Crawford gave you." He hesitated, then added, "And I know what it's like to feel trapped with nowhere to turn." There was a story there, Katherine sensed, beyond the land dispute with Crawford, but exhaustion was catching up with her, and Nash seemed to notice. "You should rest," he said, moving toward the door. "I'll come check on you in the morning, bring some fresh supplies." "Thank you," Katherine said again, the words wholly inadequate for the gratitude she felt. "For everything." Nash paused at the threshold, his tall frame silhouetted against the night sky. "Get some sleep, Katherine," he said, using her given name for the first time. "You're safe now." As the door closed behind him, Katherine sank onto the edge of the bed, the events of the day finally catching up with her. She had left her husband. She was staying in a cabin on the property of a man Crawford considered his enemy. When Crawford returned from Denver and discovered her gone, there would be consequences. Yet despite the uncertainty of her future, Katherine felt lighter than she had in months. Here, in this tiny cabin, she was free from Crawford's cold indifference and James's predatory presence. Here she could breathe. She undressed slowly, washing with the cool water from the bucket before donning her nightgown. The bed, when she climbed into it, was unexpectedly comfortable, the sheets smelling of sunshine and lavender. As sleep claimed her, Katherine's last conscious thought was of Nash's face in the lamplight and the quiet certainty in his voice when he'd said, "You're safe now." For the first time since arriving in Colorado, she believed it might be true. The days that followed took on a peaceful rhythm unlike anything Katherine had experienced since leaving Boston. She rose with the sun, breakfasting on the fresh eggs and milk Nash brought each morning. During the day, she kept busy tidying the already clean cabin, exploring the nearby woods, or reading books from the small shelf beside the bed. Nash visited daily, ostensibly to bring supplies and check on her welfare, though their conversations soon extended beyond practical matters. He told her about his ranch, the challenges of the harsh winters, the satisfaction of seeing a successful breeding program take shape, the community he'd built with Manuel, John, and the other hands. In turn, Katherine shared stories of her life in Boston, her father's business as an importer of fine textiles, her mother's death from influenza when Katherine was 16, the gradual decline of their fortunes that had led her to answer Crawford's advertisement. "I thought I was being practical," she confessed on the third evening as they sat on the cabin's porch watching the sunset. "Security seemed more important than feelings." Nash nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Survival first, I know that calculation." "But I was wrong," she continued, voicing the thought that had been forming since her wedding day. "A cage, no matter how gilded, is still a cage." They fell silent, the only sounds the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through pine needles. It was a comfortable silence, free from the tension that had characterized her interactions with Crawford. On the fourth day, Nash invited her to the main house for dinner. "Manuel makes the best chili this side of the Rio Grande," he explained, "and I thought you might be tired of your own company." Katherine accepted gratefully. Though she had found unexpected peace in her solitude, the prospect of more social interaction was welcome. She wore her simplest dress, a blue cotton that brought out her eyes, and pulled her hair back with a ribbon rather than pinning it up in her usual style. The main house was as welcoming inside as out, comfortable furniture arranged for conversation rather than show. Walls adorned with landscape paintings and a few old photographs, bookshelves filled with well-worn volumes. It was nothing like Crawford's formal, impersonal rooms. Manuel and John joined them for dinner, treating Katherine with a respect untinged by the deference Crawford's hands had shown her. They talked and laughed through the meal, sharing stories and opinions with an equality that would have been unthinkable at the Crawford ranch. "How did you all come to work together?" Katherine asked as they lingered over coffee and apple pie. The three men exchanged glances, and Nash nodded for John to begin. "I met Nash when we were both scouting for the Army," the Native American man explained. "Different sides initially." A small smile touched his lips. "We had a disagreement about territory. He nearly killed me," Nash interjected wryly. "Would have if he'd been so inclined," John shrugged. "I recognized a man worth more alive than dead." His expression grew more serious. "Later, when my people were forced onto reservations, Nash offered me work and a place to live where I wouldn't be treated like a child or a criminal." Manuel took up the story next. "I came north from Mexico looking for my sister. She had married an American and moved to Colorado, but I had lost track of her." He smiled at the memory. "I was working odd jobs in town when I got into a fight with some men who didn't like my accent. Nash stepped in, offered me work, and helped me find Maria." He gestured around them. "That was 10 years ago. I never left." Katherine looked at Nash with new appreciation. "You built a family," she observed. Nash seemed embarrassed by the characterization. "We built it together," he corrected, each bringing what the other needed. As the evening wound down, Katherine found herself reluctant to return to the solitude of her cabin, comfortable though it was. These men, Nash especially, had shown her more kindness and acceptance in a few days than Crawford had in a month of marriage. But return she did, with Nash escorting her through the moonlit woods. At her door he paused, his expression suddenly serious. "Crawford returns tomorrow," he said quietly. "Word in town is that he's cutting his trip short." Katherine's heart skipped a beat. "He knows I'm gone then." Nash nodded. "Likely, Mrs. Belmont probably telegraphed him when she realized your note was a ruse." He hesitated. "You should know there are legal implications to what you've done, a wife leaving her husband. The law generally favors the husband in such matters." "Are you saying he could force me to return?" Katherine asked, fear rising in her throat. "He could try," Nash replied, his voice hardening, "but I won't let that happen, not if it's not what you want." The fierce protectiveness in his tone sent a warmth through Katherine that had nothing to do with the mild summer night. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything?" Nash's eyes held hers for a long moment, and she thought he might say more, might even reach for her hand. Instead, he simply nodded. "Lock your door tonight," he advised. Just in case, I'll be nearby if you need anything." As she watched him walk back toward the main house, Katherine was struck by the contrast between the two men who had shaped her Colorado experience, Crawford with his cold possessiveness, and Nash with his quiet respect for her autonomy even as he offered protection. For the first time, she allowed herself to acknowledge the feelings that had been growing since that first day on the stagecoach attraction. Certainly, but also a deeper connection that transcended physical appeal. Nash truly saw her in a way Crawford never had. But she was still legally Crawford's wife. Whatever her feelings for Nash, acting on them would only complicate an already precarious situation. With a sigh, Katherine entered the cabin and locked the door as Nash had advised. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. For tonight, at least, she was safe and at peace. That peace was shattered shortly after dawn by the sound of approaching horses. Katherine, already awake and dressed, moved to the window to see Crawford himself riding toward her cabin, flanked by the sheriff and two of his ranch hands. Her heart pounding, she stepped onto the porch to meet them, determined to face what was coming with dignity. Crawford dismounted, his face dark with fury. "There you are," he spat. "Do you have any idea what you've put me through? The humiliation of having to cut short my business to retrieve my runaway wife." Katherine lifted her chin. "I left a note, a lying note," Crawford snarled. "You weren't called to Denver. You were here all along, hiding with Nash of all people." "Not hiding," she corrected calmly, though her hands trembled at her sides. "Seeking safety." Crawford turned to the sheriff, a balding man with a nervous expression. "You see, Sheriff Morris, she admits she's been here. That's kidnapping, or at the very least, harboring a man's wife against his will." Sheriff Morris looked uncomfortable. "Now, Thomas, if the lady came willingly—" "She's my wife," Crawford interrupted. "Her place is with me, willingly or not." He fixed Katherine with a cold stare. "Get your things. You're coming home." "No," the word was quiet but firm. "I'm not going back, Thomas, not after the way you dismissed my concerns about James, not after the way you've treated me as a possession rather than a partner." Crawford's face darkened further. "You don't have a choice in the matter," he growled, starting up the steps toward her. "I believe she does." Nash's voice came from behind the cabin. He stepped into view, rifle in hand, with Manuel and John flanking him. "Morning, Sheriff," he added with a nod to the lawman. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Sheriff Morris looked even more uncomfortable. "Nash, don't make this harder than it needs to be. The lady's married. Law says she belongs with her husband." "The lady has a name and a voice," Katherine interjected, finding courage in Nash's steady presence. "And I'm telling you I left of my own free will because I feared for my safety." "Safety," Crawford scoffed. "From what? I gave you everything: a fine home, nice clothes, my name." "Your son," Katherine said clearly, "made inappropriate advances toward me. When I told you, you accused me of encouraging him." A murmur ran through the assembled men. Crawford's face flushed with embarrassment and rage. "That's a lie," he hissed. "James would never." "It's the truth," Katherine insisted. "Ask Mrs. Belmont." She interrupted one of his attempts. Sheriff Morris cleared his throat. "Now, Thomas, if there's any truth to these allegations—" "There isn't," Crawford snapped. "She's making it up to justify her infidelity with Nash." Nash's expression hardened. "Careful, Crawford, that's a serious accusation." "I have witnesses who saw her meeting you in town," Crawford retorted. "Planning this elopement." "We spoke in Clara's cafe in full view of half the town," Nash countered. "Hardly the behavior of people conducting an affair." The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for the arrival of an unexpected figure, Mrs. Belmont herself, riding a mule and looking distinctly uncomfortable about it. "Mrs. Belmont," Crawford turned to his housekeeper in surprise. "What are you doing here?" The older woman dismounted stiffly, her usually severe expression troubled. "I came to set things right," she said. "I can't stand by while you accuse Mrs. Crawford of lying when I know she isn't." Crawford's face went from red to white. "What are you talking about, Mrs.?" Belmont straightened her spine. "I've worked for you for 15 years, Mr. Crawford. I've overlooked a lot of things because it wasn't my place to speak, but I was there that day in the library. I saw how Mr. James was holding Mrs. Crawford against her will. It wasn't the first time either." A heavy silence fell over the group. Sheriff Morris looked distinctly uncomfortable. "Even if that's true," Crawford said finally, his voice tight with suppressed rage, "she's still my wife. I have the right to insist she return home." "Actually," Nash interjected, "there might be another option." He turned to Katherine. "If you were to file for divorce on grounds of cruelty, the court might grant it. It's not common, but with Mrs. Belmont's testimony—" Crawford laughed harshly. "Divorce. You think any judge in Colorado will grant a divorce to a woman who abandoned her husband after less than 2 months of marriage, who ran straight into the arms of his enemy?" "I think," Sheriff Morris said slowly, surprising everyone, "that this is a matter that needs more consideration than we can give it here." He turned to Katherine. "Mrs. Crawford, are you stating for the record that you left your husband's home because you feared for your safety?" "I am," Katherine replied firmly. The sheriff nodded. "And you came to Nash's property willingly without coercion?" "Yes, Mr. Nash has been nothing but respectful and helpful." Sheriff Morris seemed to come to a decision. "Then I don't see any crime here that falls under my jurisdiction. This is a domestic matter to be resolved between you two, possibly with the help of the courts." He turned to Crawford. "I suggest you consult your lawyer, Thomas." Crawford's face contorted with fury. "You're taking her side, after all the years we've known each other." "I'm not taking sides," the sheriff replied evenly. "I'm doing my job." He tipped his hat to Katherine. "Madam, I'll be heading back to town. If you need anything, my office is always open." As the sheriff mounted his horse, Crawford made one last desperate appeal. "Katherine, please come home. We can work this out." For a moment, Katherine almost wavered. The path she was choosing would not be an easy one. Divorce was scandalous, and even if granted, would leave her in a precarious position, no longer a respectable married woman, yet not truly free in society's eyes. But then she remembered the hollow feeling that had accompanied her every day as Mrs. Crawford, the fear James's presence had instilled, the dismissal of her concerns by the man who had promised to cherish her. "No, Thomas," she said gently but firmly. "I won't be returning. I suggest you follow the sheriff's advice and consult your lawyer. I'll be filing for divorce as soon as possible." Crawford's expression hardened into something ugly. "You'll regret this," he warned, mounting his horse. "Both of you." With that, he wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his ranch hands following reluctantly behind. Mrs. Belmont remained, looking uncertain. "I can't go back there now," she said. "He'll dismiss me for sure after this." Nash stepped forward. "You're welcome to stay here as long as you need, Mrs. Belmont. What you did took courage." The older woman nodded gratefully, then turned to Katherine. "I should have spoken up sooner," she said. "I'm sorry." Katherine squeezed her hand. "You spoke up when it mattered most. Thank you." As Manuel led Mrs. Belmont toward the main house to get settled, Nash turned to Katherine. "Are you all right?" She took a deep breath, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. "Yes," she said, surprised to find it was true. "For the first time in a long time, I think I am." Nash's smile was like the breaking of dawn after a long night. "Good. That's good." They stood together on the porch, watching as the dust from Crawford's departure settled on the trail. Katherine knew the battle was far from over. Crawford would not surrender easily, and the road to divorce would be difficult and painful. But in this moment, with Nash beside her and the promise of a new day ahead, Katherine felt something she hadn't expected to find in the wild Colorado territory: hope. The weeks that followed were a strange mixture of peace and tension. Katherine remained in the small cabin, gradually making it her own with wildflowers in jars and small touches that reflected her personality rather than Crawford's preferences. Nash arranged for her to meet with a lawyer in the nearby larger town of Glenwood Springs, a progressive woman named Harriet Blackstone, who had established a reputation for handling difficult divorce cases. "It won't be easy," Harriet warned during their first meeting. "The burden of proof is on you to demonstrate cruelty or abandonment. Crawford is well respected in the community, and many will take his side simply because he's a man of means." "I understand," Katherine replied, "but I have Mrs. Belmont's testimony about James's behavior and Mr. Nash witnessed Thomas's reaction when I tried to tell him about it. Harriet nodded, making notes in her leather-bound journal. That helps, but be prepared, Crawford will likely make counter-accusations. Infidelity is the most common. Katherine felt her cheeks warm. There has been no impropriety between Mr. Nash and myself. The lawyer's shrewd eyes assessed her. But there are feelings there, she observed. On both sides, I suspect. Katherine couldn't deny it. In the weeks she'd spent at Nash's ranch, their connection had only deepened. They talked for hours each evening about books, ideas, dreams. He showed her his breeding records, taught her to ride properly, shared the vision he had for the future of his ranch. She, in turn, helped with correspondence, offered suggestions for improving the comfort of the main house, and even began teaching John's 2 young children to read. It was the most equal, respectful relationship she'd ever experienced with a man. And yes, there were feelings, powerful ones, that made her heart race when he smiled at her or their hands accidentally touched, but they had been scrupulously proper. Nash never entered her cabin without invitation and always left well before dark. They were never alone together in the main house. Both understood that even the appearance of impropriety could jeopardize her divorce case. Feelings aren't actions, Katherine told Harriet firmly. Mr. Nash has been a perfect gentleman. The lawyer smiled slightly. Good, keep it that way until the divorce is final. Crawford will have people watching, hoping to catch you in a compromising position. She was right. Katherine often noticed unfamiliar riders near the boundaries of Nash's property, and on her infrequent trips into town, she was aware of being observed and discussed. Some townspeople were openly hostile, having heard Crawford's version of events that his young wife had been seduced away by his longtime enemy. Others, particularly the women, were more sympathetic, especially after Mrs. Belmont began quietly sharing the truth about James's behavior. Crawford himself made good on his threat to fight the divorce. He filed counter-petitions claiming Katherine had abandoned her marital duties without cause and insinuating that she and Nash had been involved before she left the Crawford ranch. The legal battle dragged on through the fall, with depositions, affidavits, and hearings that required Katherine to relive painful moments and defend her character against increasingly vicious accusations. Through it all, Nash remained her steadfast supporter, never wavering in his belief that she deserved freedom and happiness. He accompanied her to every hearing, bearing Crawford's glares and the community's whispers with dignified silence. It was during the return journey from one such hearing, as the first snow of winter dusted the mountain passes, that Nash finally spoke of his feelings. I want you to know, he said as their horses picked their way carefully along the trail, that whatever happens with the divorce, you have a home with us for as long as you want it. Katherine glanced at him, touched by the offer. Thank you, I've never felt more at home anywhere. Nash nodded, his eyes on the trail ahead. I've been thinking about expanding the main house, he continued, his tone deliberately casual. Adding a proper library, maybe a music room. John's children are getting older, they should have exposure to books and culture. Katherine smiled, understanding what he wasn't saying. That sounds wonderful. I could help with the planning if you'd like. I'd like that very much. Nash finally met her gaze, his eyes reflecting feelings too deep for casual conversation. I'd like a lot of things, Katherine. But I won't speak of them until you're truly free. The simple statement, with all it implied for their future, brought tears to her eyes. I understand, she whispered, and I feel the same. They rode the rest of the way in companionable silence, both aware that a threshold had been crossed, even if they couldn't yet step fully across it. Winter settled over the Colorado mountains with a fierce intensity, blanketing the ranch in snow and ice. The legal proceedings slowed as travel became difficult, giving Katherine a respite from the constant scrutiny and stress. She used the time to establish herself more firmly in the rhythms of ranch life. She took over the household accounts, discovering a natural aptitude for figures that Nash appreciated. She organized the chaotic library in the main house, cataloging books and suggesting new acquisitions that might benefit John's children in their studies. In the evenings, the entire household would gather in the main room. Nash, Manuel, John, and his family, Mrs. Belmont, who had become a permanent addition to the staff, and occasionally other ranch hands. They would share meals, tell stories, play simple games, or simply enjoy the warmth of the fire and each other's company. It was during one such evening, with Christmas approaching, that a visitor arrived unexpectedly through the swirling snow. The knock at the door startled everyone. Few travelers braved the mountain passes during winter storms. Nash opened the door to find James Crawford standing on the porch, his face gaunt and his clothes disheveled. "I need to speak with Katherine," he said without preamble, his voice hoarse with cold or emotion. Nash's expression hardened. "That's not happening." Katherine, hearing James's voice, moved to stand beside Nash. "It's all right," she said quietly. "Let's hear what he has to say." Reluctantly, Nash stepped aside, though he remained close as James entered the warm room. The young man looked terrible thinner than Katherine remembered, with dark circles under his eyes and an uncharacteristic slump to his shoulders. "What do you want, James?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral despite the fear his presence instilled. James ran a hand through his unkempt hair. "I came to apologize," he said, the words clearly difficult for him. "For my behavior toward you, it was inexcusable." Katherine stared at him in disbelief. This was the last thing she had expected. "Why now?" she asked cautiously. James's gaze dropped to the floor. "Father is dying," he said bluntly. "Pneumonia. The doctor says he likely won't last the week." The news hit Katherine like a physical blow. Despite everything, she had never wished Crawford actual harm. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said sincerely. James nodded, accepting her sympathy. "Before he got too weak to speak, he made me promise to make things right. He finally believed what Mrs. Belmont told him about my behavior." A bitter smile twisted his lips. "It took him being on his deathbed to admit I wasn't the perfect son he imagined." Katherine glanced at Nash, whose expression had softened slightly at the news of Crawford's condition. "Does this change your father's position on the divorce?" she asked James. "Yes. He's instructed his lawyer to withdraw all objections." James reached into his coat, producing a folded document. "This is a formal retraction of his counter-petitions, signed before witnesses." Katherine took the paper with trembling hands. "Thank you," she said quietly. James straightened his shoulders. "I should go. Father's asking for you," he added, looking directly at Nash. "I don't know why, but he wants to speak with you before he goes." Nash exchanged a glance with Katherine. "I'll come," he said after a moment. "Katherine." She hesitated, uncertain whether she wanted to see Crawford again, even on his deathbed. But something, perhaps the memory of the hope she'd felt when first answering his advertisement, made her nod. "I'll come too." The ride to the Crawford ranch was slow and difficult through the snowy darkness. They arrived to find the house ablaze with lights. Various neighbors and business associates gathered to pay their respects to the dying man. Mrs. Wilson, the banker's wife who had once looked at Katherine with such disapproval, now approached with sympathy in her eyes. "He's asking for you both," she said, leading them upstairs to the master bedroom. Crawford lay propped against pillows, his once robust frame wasted by illness. His eyes, however, were clear and alert as they entered. "So you came," he said, his voice a shadow of its former authority. Nash stepped forward. "You asked for me. Here I am." Crawford's gaze moved to Katherine. "And you, still beautiful even after all this." Katherine remained silent, uncertain what to say to this man who had briefly been her husband. Crawford coughed, the sound rattling ominously in his chest. "I wanted to see you both before I go," he managed when the spasm passed. "To make things right if I can." "You've withdrawn your objections to the divorce," Katherine said. "James showed us the document." Crawford nodded weakly. "That's part of it, but there's more." He gestured for Nash to come closer. "The land," he said. "Your grandfather's western pastures. I knew the deed was valid. I bribed the county clerk to lose the original records." Nash's face showed no surprise, only grim confirmation of what he had long suspected. "Why tell me now?" "Because I'm dying," Crawford replied with a ghost of his old impatience. "And I'd rather not face my maker with that sin unconfessed." He reached for a folder on the bedside table, handing it to Nash with shaking hands. The original deed, along with a signed confession of what I did. It's all there. The land is yours again, legally and rightfully. Nash took the folder, his expression unreadable. Thank you, he said simply. Crawford turned his attention to Katherine. I was a poor husband to you, he admitted. I saw you as a possession, not a person. For that, I ask your forgiveness. Katherine felt unexpected tears stinging her eyes. I forgive you, Thomas, she said softly, meaning it. A measure of peace seemed to settle over Crawford's features. Good, that's good. He closed his eyes briefly, gathering strength. There's one more thing. My will, I've changed it. James, who had been standing silently by the door, stepped forward in alarm. Father, Crawford waved him to silence. The ranch goes to you, James, as always, but I've set aside a portion of my liquid assets, a substantial portion, as a trust for Katherine. Independent of the divorce settlement. Katherine stared at him in shock. I don't understand. Consider it restitution, Crawford said, for the brief happiness I promised but failed to provide. He looked between her and Nash, a knowing expression in his feverish eyes. Use it to build something better than I managed to create. With that, his strength seemed to leave him. His eyes drifted closed, his breathing becoming more labored. The doctor, who had been waiting discreetly in the corner, moved forward to check his pulse. He needs rest now, he said quietly. You should go. As they left the room, James followed them into the hallway. I didn't know about the trust, he said, his expression troubled, or the land deed. Nash studied the younger man. What will you do now? He asked. James shrugged, a gesture that made him look suddenly very young. Try to be better, I suppose, run the ranch, make amends where I can. He looked directly at Katherine. Starting with you, I am truly sorry for my behavior. Katherine nodded, accepting his apology if not entirely trusting his reformation. I hope you find peace, James. Outside, as Nash helped her onto her horse for the journey back to his ranch, Katherine found herself unexpectedly moved by the night's events. He tried to make things right, she said softly. At the end, Nash mounted his own horse, the folder with the precious deed secured inside his coat. Some things can be made right, he agreed. Others leave scars that never fully heal. They rode in thoughtful silence for a time, the only sounds the soft crunch of snow beneath their horses' hooves and the occasional call of a night bird. What will you do with the land? Katherine finally asked as they crossed onto Nash property. Nash considered the question. Restore it. Use it as it was meant to be used. He glanced at her, his expression softening in the moonlight. Build something new there, perhaps. The implication was clear, and Katherine felt her heart quicken. That sounds like a worthy project, she said. It would be better with a partner, Nash replied, his meaning unmistakable now. Someone with vision and strength, someone who understands what it means to rebuild after loss. Katherine smiled, a full, genuine smile that reflected the joy bubbling up inside her. I might know someone who fits that description. Nash's answering smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. I was hoping you might. Thomas Crawford died peacefully in his sleep 3 days later. The funeral was well attended, with most of Willow Creek turning out to pay respects to one of its founding citizens. Katherine stood quietly at the back of the church, acknowledging the curious glances with dignified composure. Nash stood beside her, a solid presence that anchored her through the difficult day. They had not spoken further about the future, both understanding that propriety demanded they wait until the divorce was final and a suitable period of mourning had passed. But in the weeks that followed, as winter gradually loosened its grip on the mountains, their shared vision for the future took shape in small, meaningful ways. They rode together to the western pastures, now legally Nash's once more, and discussed where a new house might stand. Katherine sketched plans for gardens that would thrive in the Colorado climate, while Nash consulted with a builder about modern conveniences that could be incorporated. In early April, as the first wildflowers began to dot the meadows, Katherine received official notification that her divorce had been granted. The document arrived by post, its legal language stark and impersonal for something that represented such profound change in her life. She was no longer Mrs. Thomas Crawford. She was Katherine Adams once more, a woman free to choose her own path. That evening, as the sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and pink, Nash asked her to walk with him to the ridge overlooking the western pastures. Spring was well established now, the land awakening from its winter slumber with vibrant green growth and the song of returning birds. They stood in comfortable silence for a time, watching as the shadows lengthened across the valley. "I have something for you," Nash said finally, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small leather pouch, which he handed to Katherine with uncharacteristic nervousness. Inside, she found a ring, not an ostentatious diamond like the one Crawford had given her, but a simple gold band set with a small, perfect pearl. "It was my mother's," Nash explained as Katherine looked up at him with wide eyes. "My father gave it to her when they homesteaded here. It represents building something from nothing, creating a life together." He took a deep breath. "I'm asking if you'll build that life with me, Katherine, as my wife, my partner in everything." Katherine felt tears of joy welling in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered, her voice catching. "Yes, Nathaniel, I will." He slipped the ring onto her finger where it sat perfectly, as if made for her. Then, finally, after months of careful restraint, he drew her into his arms and kissed her a kiss full of promise and passion and the certainty of shared tomorrows. As they walked back to the ranch hand in hand, Katherine reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had come to Colorado seeking safety, answering an advertisement from a man who offered security but not love. Instead, she had found Nathaniel Nash, a man who had given her both, healing wounds she hadn't even recognized she carried. Their wedding, held in late June as wildflowers carpeted the mountain meadows, was everything her first marriage ceremony had not been: joyous, intimate, and filled with genuine emotion. They exchanged vows under a canopy of blue sky, surrounded by the family they had chosen. Manuel and his sister's family, John and his children, Mrs. Belmont, and a few close friends from town. Katherine wore a simple dress of cream silk newly made, with no connection to her past, and carried a bouquet of wildflowers gathered that morning. Nash wore a new suit, his usually unruly hair tamed for the occasion, his eyes never leaving her face as Pastor Williams led them through vows they had written themselves. "I take you as my partner in all things," Nash promised, his voice steady and sure. "To build with you, to grow with you, to face whatever comes with you by my side. I choose you freely and with my whole heart," Katherine responded, the words flowing from a place of absolute certainty. "To share joy and sorrow, triumph and struggle all the days of our lives." The celebration afterward was more festive than formal tables set up in the shade of cottonwood trees. Mexican dishes prepared by Manuel's family served alongside American classics, music and dancing that continued well into the night. As darkness fell and lanterns were lit, Nash led his bride away from the festivities toward the ridge where he had proposed. There, in the silvery moonlight, he showed her the foundation stones of what would become their new home, a house designed to blend the best of East and West, tradition and innovation, just as their marriage would. "Our beginning," he said, drawing her close. Katherine leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid strength of him against her, the promise of a future unfolding before them like the vast Colorado sky. "Our beginning," she agreed, tilting her face up for his kiss. 5 years later, Katherine stood on the porch of that house, now a warmly elegant home filled with books, music, and laughter, watching as Nash taught their 3-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, to ride her first pony. The little girl, with her mother's auburn hair and her father's storm-gray eyes, sat fearlessly on the gentle animal, her delighted giggles carrying across the sunlit yard. Beside Katherine, cradled in her arms, their 6-month-old son, Michael, observed the scene with solemn interest. He was quieter than his sister, more thoughtful, but with the same strong spirit that characterized both his parents. The western pastures that had once been the source of such bitter conflict between Nash and Crawford now supported a thriving breeding operation, producing some of the finest horses in Colorado. The Nash Ranch had become known not just for its quality stock, but for its progressive practices, fair treatment of workers, cooperation with Native American tribes, and innovative methods that respected the land. Katherine herself had established a small school on the property, initially for John's children, but eventually expanding to include the children of other ranch workers, and even some from neighboring properties. Her trust from Crawford, combined with Nash's restored land, had given them the resources to build something truly remarkable, a community based on mutual respect and shared purpose. As she watched her husband and daughter, Katherine reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment of perfect contentment. She had come to Colorado as a mail-order bride, hoping merely for safety and security. What she had found instead was healing for wounds she hadn't even recognized she carried. Nash looked up, catching her eye across the yard. His smile, still capable of making her heart skip a beat after all these years, held the same love and appreciation it had from the beginning, the recognition of a soul that complemented his own. He said something to Elizabeth, then lifted her from the pony and set her on her feet. The little girl immediately ran toward the house, her face alight with excitement. "Mama," she called, "did you see? I was riding all by myself." Katherine descended the porch steps to meet her daughter, shifting Michael to one arm so she could embrace Elizabeth with the other. "I saw, darling. You were very brave." Nash joined them, one hand coming to rest naturally on Katherine's waist while the other gently stroked his son's downy head. "Just like her mother," he said, his voice warm with pride and love. Katherine leaned into his touch, the simple contact still a source of joy after 5 years of marriage. "I think she gets her fearlessness from both of us." They stood together in the golden afternoon light, the family they had created, the love they had built, the wounds they had healed together. Around them, the ranch thrived, a testament to what could grow from difficult beginnings when nurtured with care and respect. Katherine had once believed that practical concerns outweighed matters of the heart, that security was more important than love. Nash had shown her that the truest security came from being fully seen and accepted, from building a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine affection. As they walked back to the house together, their children between them, Katherine sent a silent prayer of gratitude to whatever fate had brought her to this wild, beautiful place, and to the cowboy who had given her not just safety, but the kind of love that truly heals.